So this is part 2 on Reconstruction. Okay, so again, I'm just going to kind of show these points, but then elaborate on them to a large extent. And I mean, ultimately, one of the first very, very important parts about Reconstruction was that, to a large extent, emancipated slaves, now known as freedmen, were sort of going through their own kind of identity crisis, realized that slavery had perpetuated for so long in the United States that they did not really realize what their role was to be after slavery was over. So it's interesting, this is a relatively simplified, this is an interesting summary, but to a large extent, to move about, that didn't always happen. I mean, ultimately, yes, finally families could reunite if they were sold into separate families, but some other people really didn't think that moving about was an option. They felt like the only life they knew was on the plantation that they grew up in. Again, this point kind of elaborates on that as well. Just the idea that even people who left to find another job, possibly in a city, possibly in a place farther north, many times would just return to the exact place they came from. And in certain instances, they actually went right back to the house and or master that they had worked under when they were slaves. This is an interesting point, right? That slaves no longer that they had the freedom to kind of see themselves as equal to whites. I would say that that point is only true for the very beginning of Reconstruction. Once we see black codes, this is no longer true. Okay, so quintessential African American family. I mean, ultimately, we'll see to a certain extent a continuation of the kind of African American family under slavery, but not completely. One of the things that's important to consider is that, again, reuniting, right? Any family that was sold away from their previous, ultimately from their family, finds that they can come back together with a family, with a husband, with a child that was sold away from them. Gender roles, interesting to consider. We could talk about this a little bit more in class. We could think about what the average gender role was for families under slavery prior to the Civil War, and how when they become freedmen, this kind of relationship may evolve. To a large extent, we see many families, sort of single parent households existing in the years prior to the Civil War because marriage between slaves was illegal. So that's an interesting thing to consider. We see much more of a patriarchal or patrilineal, you could even see, society after slavery is over because, again, marriage between freedmen was legal, whereas marriage between slaves was not. But many women, due to economic necessity, continue to work outside the home. All right, church as well as school. Now realize that in the years prior to the Civil War, religion was a very, very important pillar to African American communities. It changes only in the sense that, again, now it can be done overtly. It can be done outside instead of in hiding, instead of at night. So that's kind of what this point is getting at. So next point, realize that churches, again, were largely illegal among slave communities. But after emancipation, we find that there are African American churches that are established, predominantly in the South, although that's not 100% true. Many of them were of Protestant sects, especially Methodist, Baptist, religions that became very popular during the Second Great Awakening. Education, also huge, huge, huge during the Reconstruction period. And the Freedmen's Bureau, which I mentioned in the previous video, this is something that offers supplies, offers funds for education primarily for not only emancipated slaves, but also free whites, or poor whites, that is. So this is a really, really important thing that the federal government establishes that allows some progress for African American families. Black colleges, the most famous, I would argue, would be the Tuskegee Institute, which still exists, and we can talk about that more in class as well. It's a complicated understanding to really gather what the purpose behind a school predominantly for African Americans was when it was initially founded. All right, labor after slavery. Okay, most importantly, remember that under slavery, the majority, not exclusively, but the majority of slaves worked in agricultural sectors. Because they have little to no job skills after the Civil War is over, this kind of agricultural life perpetuates, it continues. And the problem here is that once Reconstruction starts to wane in strength, we find that it is virtually impossible for emancipated slaves, or freedmen, as we call them, to purchase land of their own. And we're going to talk about sharecropping in a moment, but really, owning land was basically a pipe dream for emancipated slaves. It was very, very hard for them to accomplish this. Freedmen's Bureau. Interesting. So Freedmen's Bureau, the establishment that was meant to help freedmen, also reaches a point in its later days where it kind of goes back on itself. Land that was given to freedmen after the Civil War was land, in many cases, that had been previously owned by a Confederate. So the Freedmen's Bureau finds itself in around 1869, 1870 to kind of go back on some of its original tenets, and one of those was the 40 acres and a mule principle. So this goes away, right? No longer was their land amply available for emancipated slaves. Also realized that there were forms of labor that were very similar to slavery. One of the most common is the concept of a chain gang, or almost like prison labor. Of course, this is something that many ex-slaves do not like, but if we consider how Jim Crow kind of spread and became increasingly favored by former Confederates, you can see that sometimes chain gangs or prison labor was something that happened much to the chagrin of freedmen, but really they had no other choice. There were no other jobs available to them. Sharecropping. Okay, this is a huge economic concept, okay? I'll talk about sharecropping more in class, but the basic principle is it's like a tenant farmer, right? So if you are a sharecropper, you do not own any land, you rent it, and you take a proportion of your crop and you give that to your landlord in order to both live on and farm that amount of property. Sharecroppers were frequently in debt to their landlords, but there are a few things that are more, I guess, you could say convenient or a little bit more free than the institution of slavery. Sharecroppers, unlike slaves, were not at the beck and call of their masters. They could work on their own schedule, and they also could establish quotas for themselves. At the same time, though, remember that because they had to pay their landlord in a share of their crop, they still oftentimes had to work very, very long hours and produce many crops in order to break even. Okay, this is also interesting. This kind of establishes the concept of communal farming under sharecropping. So that's kind of what that point is getting at. African American politics. We talked about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in class earlier today, or yesterday, if you're watching the video on Tuesday. So realize that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do start to introduce the ability for African Americans to be represented in government. So the vast majority, although not exclusively, but the vast majority of African Americans in politics identified with the Republican Party. And this is a very, very interesting point. Realize that 5 states in the former Confederacy once they enacted these new civil rights amendments, the majority of the voting population was black instead of white. So that kind of shows you um, what the southern states look like in terms of the population and in terms of the makeup. We talked about that earlier, but it's an important point to keep in mind. So the majority of the population overall in these states that were in the Deep South was of slaves or free blacks, and once they get the right to vote, that will reflect itself upon some of the voting results. So many former slaves join an organization called the Union League. I wouldn't say that that's crucial for IB. The other thing is that we start to see the prominence of, again, African American elected officials or just prominent African American leaders. They may not necessarily be in politics, but they still emerge as kind of leading members of their community. And they were seen kind of as a goal for other families to strive to meet. So there were several African Americans who served in Congress after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And that is because of largely the Wade Davis bill. Even if it was vetoed, we see that there is an improvement in the attention to African Americans following the war. Not just the Wade Davis bill. I would argue that these amendments, again, are huge for Black political participation. I don't want to dwell on this too much. I think that this section is a little bit more straightforward. But realize overall that white supremacy continues with some exceptions. Actually, we talked about this the other day in a previous video, so be familiar with carpetbaggers, scalawags, and so on, but I'm going to move on from this slide. I'm also going to move on from this one because we talked about this one the other day. Instead, I want to move on to here. So again, this is all social policy for this part of the Reconstruction video. All right, so realize that many white Southerners who were Democrats believed that the Republican Party was not legitimate. They did not think that it was valid in the South. Republicans in the South, again, we call them either carpetbaggers or scalawags. Different depending on if you were from the South or if you were not. If you were from the North and moved to the South and you were a Republican, you could be considered a carpetbagger. If you're from the South and you're a Republican, you are a scalawag. The KKK starts to emerge right after the 13th Amendment is ratified, right? And grows in strength until the KKK Act, which we will talk about a little bit more, but ultimately realize that when the KKK emerges, Congress also responds to the KKK with not only the Civil Rights Act, but the KKK Act, which essentially makes it illegal for the KKK to organize, especially in terms of its violent tendencies. And this kind of goes along with the KKK Act as well, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. All right, we talked about this a little bit, I believe, the other day, the idea of redemption, that once we have Andrew Johnson as well as Ulysses S. Grant as president, we are considering the Reconstruction to be redemption rather than Reconstruction, which almost sounds like revenge, returning the South to the status quo before the Civil War. Okay, King Cotton, a pretty important concept, and I'll show you this map in a second, but realize that cotton already by the invention of the cotton gin, 1793, was a significant cash crop and significant crop for the textile industry in the South. But the South was so dependent on cotton by the outbreak of the Civil War that we see this as almost a uniform economy with just one industry dominating the rest. Cotton ruled the South. Cropland system, essentially this is a system that allows for a way to take out a loan in order to produce a crop, but I wouldn't worry about that as much for the IB. Cotton prices. All right. I mean, ultimately, I don't even think that I need to go through every point here. Just realize how significant cotton was in terms of structuring the South. And when the cotton prices fell, so did the Southern economy, which was not good for the South. All right, we talked about that, talked about that, talked about that. So I'm going to show you this map of cotton is king, or king cotton. So to interpret this map, pretty straightforward. The darker the map, the more sharecropping existed in the region. So pay attention to particularly South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, many parts of eastern Texas. This is where sharecropping was the most popular. We will talk about this more in class, but sharecropping was a system that perpetuated many of the qualities of slavery without actually calling it slavery. So this one is much shorter. I hope that makes you happy. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers in class, and thanks for watching again.